European Commission. Let's hear what they have to say.
On the second day of the formal EUCO, we just released the conclusions on external relations and Ukraine. President, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup. Bonjour à chacune et à chacun. Nous venons de clôturer le Conseil européen qui est extrêmement fructueux. On a eu l'occasion ensemble avec Ursula pendant
We have just concluded a European Council.
De communiquer sur l'accord qui a été conclu.
We had quite a lengthy night along with Ursula, wanted to communicate along with the agreements we've made on energy. It's a very important agreement indeed.
Dans les dernières heures, une baisse significative des prix.
Over recent hours, there's been a significant price reduction. So we are acting in concert as Europeans and mobilizing together. And this is initiated by the European Council, so that we can take the necessary steps to ensure the critical and strong response to protect our citizens. We had two topics this morning that were very important on the agenda: a strategic discussion and debate on our relations with China. We also took on board other affairs matters too. And once again, we've touched upon how we will continue to act in support of Ukraine and implement the tools that we have at our disposal to put pressure on Russia. A few elements to summarize this discussion. The aim is not to come up with written conclusions, but truly to discuss strategy to prepare the next major meeting, and that will be with the ASEAN countries here in December. And that's the first element. We have taken stock of the fact that the Chinese political system does not operate along the same rules as we do. We consider that we are a democracy, and that is a very pivotal issue. Whereas in China, the point of departure in China is that the state and indeed the party is the determining criteria. So you are operating with a very different matrix, a very different political system, and this is an objective, neutral way of ascertaining the facts. We haven't looked at various levers, though. We have to be strong and upright and defend the principles that we believe in, the strongly fundamental rights of freedoms of Europeans. We are committed to introducing more reciprocity and in economic relations with China and Europe. And this is work that will have to be done across the board in all topics. And it is it's closely connected to and engaging with China on other subjects like climate change, which is a very obvious topic. And we want to engage with China on this discussion. So this discussion showed a very clear will to stop being naive and to embark and to not embark on systematic confrontation. We have our own model to develop and build, and to model and form our relations with China. We have to ensure that we can respond to the way our program is organized. And there has been this great consensus for some time now and convergence amongst the European leaders about the importance of truly developing strategic autonomy, the capacity to be less dependent on to increase our independence, but also as part of that to reinforce and diversify our partnerships with the rest of the world. We had a summit in February in Brussels with African countries, and that was an opportunity to build the foundations for a new relationship, a new mutual relationship, a partner-to-partner relationship with Africa. We wanted to ensure that we, the leaders, can deliver on the promises that we have made, and we don't want to add to any disillusionment. So we have to assess the promises we make, how they're implemented, and how they are being brought about. This is a very strong tool, and this is something that needs regular political assessment to make sure the objectives we set ourselves are met and that our partners get the best from the relationships they have with the European Union. In Latin America next year, under the Spanish presidency, there will be a summit in Brussels with Latin American countries, and we are preparing this summit and the Indo-Pacific region as well. We'll have the meeting here in Brussels in December. We need to engage with the rest of the world and diversify our partnerships and build strategies to ensure that we are more independent. And this is a link to a dense discussion that we had in a few hours. It reflects what we discussed in March in Versailles, and this was on the strategies of the European Union. There are three key pillars that we have to work on: reinforce our capacity to influence and defend our interests and promote our values. The first pillar is energy. We've said a lot about that recently, so we continue to be extremely committed to building autonomy and sovereignty in this area, because when we are very dependent, there are costs, there is a price, and there are difficulties in energy dependency. So we are trying to deal with that issue. The second pillar is security and defence. This is a key moment to reinforce European defence and increase cooperation amongst ourselves. This is very close cooperation with NATO. We are actively looking at declarations at the part of NATO and EU, the technological leadership as well. We want to look at technologies for the future too. There are stakes that are also touched upon by the previous topics. We have strengths, we have weaknesses. We have to ensure the technological independence. We have to act and mobilize the resources that we have, and we have to encourage innovation, technological development, and be ambitious in this area. These are a few elements, a few of lines of thought that show the density of the discussions we've just had and the fact that it was all directly linked to the current issues. We are in a phase of geopolitical transition, and it's important that we have clear ideas, that we act in concert. That is the best summary of the very spirit of our discussions at this summit. And then on to Iran. We haven't referenced this in the conclusions. Protection of women is very important and very clear. Sanctions have been taken against those who are participating in the repression of peaceful demonstrations. And this is, of course, linked to their support of Russia and against Ukraine. So again, there were in-depth discussions there. We looked at the situation in Ukraine and interventions. We had a virtual intervention from President Zelensky, and we have looked at our support for Ukraine. There's a lot of support for Ukraine, military, financial, humanitarian, political, and we have to put pressure against the offending regime. And we also have to look at the freezing of assets that have been seized that are used for reconstruction and support of Ukraine. There will be a conference there. The Commission and the World Food Programme are involved in this. The international community is involved in the coordination, the very strong coordination in the short term, to preserve Ukraine and to bear in mind this major act. A few weeks ago, when we granted Ukraine candidate status, which is very important, we also need to act that this is a credible and strong perspective for Ukraine. So we've been working on this very directly. So it was a very fruitful conversation within a reasonable time frame on a very difficult subject. And this has certainly demonstrated that we have this conviction that when we meet together, we can increase our influence and have genuine, constructive impacts. We have work to do, and this lies ahead of us. And this summit should give us confidence for the work we have to do in the months to come.
We had a very good discussion this morning, again, after having yesterday agreed on this huge energy package. There's a lot of work now ahead of us, what the energy is concerned, but the roadmap is very clear, and it was good to have this unanimity, this broad support for the roadmap that we have put forward. Today, the focus was indeed on the two topics, Ukraine and China. And here, looking at Ukraine, let me first of all focus on the financing of Ukraine. As you know, we had agreed to have 9 billion of macrofinancial assistance to Ukraine, which will be partially dispersed till the end of the year. Overall, so far, the European Union, the European level, have supported Ukraine since the beginning of the year with by now 19 billion euros. But the focus was in the discussion more now on the year to come. It is very important for Ukraine to have a predictable and stable flow of income, and therefore we assume, and Ukraine is telling us that they need approximately 3 to 4 billion euros per month to have enough resources for the basics. And these 3 to 4 billion euros should be financed by the European Union, by our American friends, and by the financial institutions. Therefore, the discussion was round about 1.5 billion per month for Ukraine, financed by the European Union. So this would give overall a figure of 18 billion for the next year, an amount where then Ukraine can count on and where there's a stable and reliable, predictable flow of income. We have tasked the finance ministers to develop the appropriate mechanism, but it was important also to give this signal to Ukraine that we very well know how important this reliable flow of income is. Of course, there are other topics on the agenda. Having seen in the last days the atrocious and deliberate attacks of Russia against civilian infrastructure, Ukraine has other needs that have to be addressed. For example, the mobilization of humanitarian aid to help the most vulnerable in Ukraine to get through this winter. In particular, the more than 11 million internally displaced people by now who need support, who need access to water, electricity, heating, who need shelter. We have announced this week that we will provide a further 175 million euros for food, for shelter, for health support and for education. And we will provide emergency shelters in the Rivne, Bucha and Kharkiv regions. Of course, we are in very close contact now with the Ukrainian authorities to look at how we can restore as best and as much as possible electricity, water supply and other essential services like, for example, heating. For that purpose, Commissioner Lenarčič was on site this week to assess the situation, to activate the civil protection mechanism and to look at how best and quickly we can support Ukraine to deal with these vicious and atrocious attacks on the civilian infrastructure. This is the immediate support, but of course there is also the mid- and long-term support for reconstruction. And indeed, next week we will have, in the context of the German G7 presidency, co-hosted by the Chancellor and me, a conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine. This is a conference that looks at the how should we address the reconstruction. It is a huge task. It is an international conference. The best experts worldwide will join and discuss how to best approach technically, but also financially this reconstruction process together not only with the European Union but also with our global partners. And, of course, the reconstruction process and the massive investments that are necessary should be aligned with the needs for reform in order to really pave already the path to EU membership Ukraine, as you know, is a candidate country, so everything should be focused on this common journey that we will undertake together. The second topic was indeed China. And yes, the discussion showed that we're witnessing quite an acceleration of trends and tensions. It was very clear from the Congress that we've seen that President Xi is continuing to reinforcing the very assertive and self-reliant course China has taken. And clearly, China is continuing a mission to establish its dominance in East Asia and its influence globally. And at the same time, we have been witnessing, you will recall that in February, the so-called agreement on no limits partnership between Russia and China right before the invasion in Ukraine. So these developments will affect the EU-China relationship. The Chinese system is fundamentally different from ours, and we are aware of the nature of the rivalry. And against this backdrop, we had a very good strategic discussion on our relationship with China. Obviously, we have to be very vigilant when it comes to dependencies, and we've learned our lesson what the overdependency on fossil fuels from Russia is concerned and how tough but necessary it is to get rid of this dependency. In the case of China, it is the risk of dependency on technologies and raw materials, and therefore the priorities here are to reinforce our own capacities and, of course, also to diversify the supply of raw materials towards reliable, trustworthy suppliers. In this context, the CHIPS Act concerning semiconductors, so technologies, and the Critical Raw Materials Act are the major initiatives that we have put on the table. They are basically the strategic response to our dependencies. But so are also the free trade agreements and raw material partnerships that we are working on with other countries, in other words, with reliable partners. The recent foreign direct investment screening is also a strong tool that has been given to us. So with our new instruments, like the International Procurement Instrument and the Regulation on Foreign Subsidies, we will have a new foundation how to approach China. Those two, the International Procurement Instrument and the foreign subsidies, these regulations will enter into force in spring next year. This shows there is a broad approach on the judicial side towards the risks that we see in the relationship with China, also the difficulties to achieve a level playing field, and the steps forward we have taken to solve here the imbalances and to re-level the playing field. I hope we can soon add another layer to that. That will be our anti-coercion instrument. A broad discussion on all these different topics, an excellent discussion and a very good council. And with that, Barend, I give the floor back to you.
Thank you, Madam President. Sam, we'll start with you. Sam Fleming.
Thanks very much. Sam Fleming from the Financial Times. I had two questions on China.
We just heard there from Charles Michel. We just heard there from Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, who have just done their final press conference after a two-day European Council summit, where they discussed China and its influence with Russia and also Ukraine, as well as how to secure energy for the rest of Europe. Stay tuned for more information on Euronews.
An invasion